out myself very quickly as the only person in the room who uses a flip phone, not a smartphone. Our panel today, I'm just going to introduce everybody now and tell you who they are, and then we'll get started. And this is the order everyone is speaking in. Chris Holman, to my right, who is a professor at the University of Missouri in Kansas City, not Columbia. Next to him, Jim Calkins, who is Associate General Counsel and a Vice President at Sanofi. Next to him is Mike Walker, who was, until yesterday, Vice President and Assistant General Counsel, Chief IP Counsel at Dupont, but just retired yesterday. And
Thank you. What I'm doing here is I couldn't find someone to take my spot. and I'm a good friend of Mark's, and I wanted to come and support Mark.
And then to his right, of course, Mark Schultz, who everybody here knows at SIU and one of the founders of CPIP. So Chris is going to start us off.
Okay, so I was kind of asked to talk a little bit about patent eligibility, what's going on from the biopharma perspective. So, you know, we have the recent Supreme Court decisions. We have this Mayo-Alice two-part test for patent eligibility. So we're dealing with that now. Just to review, the first step, determine whether the claims are directed to a patent ineligible concept. And I break it down. There's really two patent ineligible concepts, I would say. There's the abstract idea, which has largely been directed towards kind of computer implemented things. And I would say really what it's getting at is non-technological inventions. The Supreme Court doesn't like inventions that are not directed at technology. But I'm not going to talk about that much because I'm going to focus more on law of nature, natural phenomenon, which is what's really affecting biopharma. And I think that's really about trying the idea you don't want to tie up the building blocks of future innovation. I think that's where the Supreme Court's coming from. Now, of course, prior to the Federal Circuit, it's long been the law that you cannot patent abstract ideas, natural phenomenon. I think the main thing that, one of the main things the Supreme Court has done is refocused what the invention is. And I think in the Federal Circuit, we've had this idea that the name of the game is the claim, and it's all about, you know, the invention is whatever the claim covers. And the Supreme Court has rejected that idea. And according to the Supreme Court, it's not what the claim language covers. They're looking for, well, what is the actual invention there? And there's just a different focus, which is largely leading to these different outcomes. Okay, step one, is it directed to a natural phenomenon? If the answer is yes, you have to look for additional elements, the inventive concept, something there, a sufficient quantum of something extra to render it patent eligible. Okay, so here's the Mayo claim. Look, we can look at this. This is the Prometheus claim that was invalid in the Mayo case, invalidated. You notice it involves, it's basically what the Supreme Court would say is the real invention here was the recognition that you could determine the optimal drug dosage for certain drugs by doing a diagnostic test. You look for a drug metabolite in the body, and it tells you whether you should adjust the dosage. Okay, but the way it's claimed, the claim recites administering a drug to a patient to create this breakdown product, doing the diagnostic test to look for the breakdown product, and then you have these funny kind of where-in steps that are where the trouble begins, because it's a where-in step, but it's really was interpreted as the doctor or whoever does the test being aware that the dosage should be adjusted. Okay? When the Federal Circuit looked at this case under the kind of the name of the game is a claim approach, they said, well, look, step one, administering a drug. Isn't that just a conventional method of treatment drug claim? Those have long been considered patent eligible. This claim must be patent eligible, regardless of whether they've added some other steps, like recognizing that the dosage should be adjusted. Adding this additional step does not render the claim patent ineligible. That's not how the Supreme Court looked at it. What the Supreme Court said is, no, but that's administering the drug is not the invention. It was already known that you would administer, people were already using this drug to treat patients. It was known how to do the determining diagnostic test. The actual invention here was this recognition that the dosage should be adjusted based on what you find in the diagnostic test. And the Supreme Court said, well, you can't patent that. That's a natural phenomenon, and that's what really this claim is aimed at. This claim is patent ineligible. So that's where you get the different outcomes, and that's what's kind of leading to the problems we have nowadays. according to the Supreme Court, the claim was directed to a law of nature. And what is the law of nature? The law of nature is the interaction of a synthetic molecule, a drug breakdown product, with the human body. And so I think it's 2009, I filed an amicus brief on the behalf of some law professors and with the Federal Circuit. And we said there's a real problem with defining a natural phenomenon as including interactions of synthetic molecules with the human body. Because what the district court said was, well, these interactions are all dictated by laws of biology. The way a drug interacts with the body, that's a natural phenomenon. It's dictated by the laws of biology. And what I said was, well, under that logic, the Wright brothers' invention, it's the interaction of a wing with the air, that's all dictated by the laws of physics. It's not really creating a distinction. And that's, I think, part of the bottom line that we're seeing nowadays is this idea of natural phenomena is being found to encompass pretty much any invention that they're seeing in the realm of biotech. Okay. Let's see. Okay, and then you get to the step 2 in Mayo where so they found this interaction with the body as a natural phenomena, and they found that doctors are just using that the claim is directed to just using routine conventional steps like administering drugs, doing the diagnostic test. It's patent ineligible. They also talked about this idea of preemption, that if the claim could unduly preempt use of this natural phenomenon. So you have these two ideas. There needs to be an inventive concept. We don't want preemption. Okay. Ariosa Diagnostics, this is a recent Federal Circuit decision. I just filed a brief on behalf of Biotech Industry Organization and PhRMA, the Pharmaceutical Research Manufacturers of America, in this case asking for en banc rehearing. This is a claim directed to diagnostics. It was found to be patent ineligible. It's basically directed, well, it's kind of a diagnostic method. In doing the analysis, the Federal Circuit found a natural phenomenon because the claim, it said, well, it starts off with DNA, it ends with DNA. Those are natural phenomena, and so the claim is directed towards a natural phenomena, totally disregarding that really the claim was about gathering diagnostic information. But so they found this to be a natural phenomenon, and they found, well, the inventors didn't create or alter any of the genetic information. Okay, so this is just a natural phenomenon that's going on here. And the court went on to find that, the methods that are being used, that are covered by the claim for actually performing the diagnostic test, those are conventional. And under Mayo, if you've got a natural phenomena and you're only using conventional methods, conventional techniques, it's patent ineligible. You see how the Federal Circuit is focusing on the invention as opposed to the claims. The only subject matter new and useful as of the date of the application was the discovery of the presence of the DNA in the plasma or serum. In other words, the invention didn't have to do with the technology of doing the analysis. The invention had to do with the discovery of the existence of genetic information that could be tested for. So that language would seem to apply in general to diagnostic tests and genetic tests. Kind of thankfully, the Federal Circuit did not go down the preemption route, but this is what the district court did in terms of preemption. The district court said, well, this claim preempts uses of this natural phenomenon. And the patent owner submitted evidence that there was actually ways of looking for this genetic information that were not covered by the patent. But the court said, yeah, but you haven't proven that those are commercially viable. And so there's this interpretation of preemption that not only are you not allowed to preempt uses of the natural phenomena, you cannot even if there are some uses, they have to be proven to be commercially viable. And what was used against the patent owner was statements by the management of the company. The management basically made statements saying what you'd like to say, which is, we just in-licensed the patent. It seems to give us broad coverage in our field. By doing that, that was evidence that they had preempted. And so you're kind of in a tough situation because what's the point of a patent if you can't clear some space for your business, but it's being used as evidence that your claim is patent ineligible? At least in the district court did that. Okay, here's another interesting case. This one's going to the Federal Circuit. Hasn't been decided yet, but Bio also filed an amicus brief in this case. The invention here is basically human liver cells. Is it limited to human? Well, it's liver cells. It would cover human liver cells. In the prior art, it was thought, if you freeze and thaw liver cells, you'd kill them mostly. And this was an invention where they discovered how you could actually kind of freeze them, thaw them, pull out the very few that were still alive and viable, and then it turns out those cells could be repeatedly frozen and thawed. Okay, so it looks like a pretty good invention, but the district court here found, well, that's an ineligible law of nature. The discovery that hepatocytes are capable of surviving multiple freeze-thaw cycles. Okay, so yeah, it's an example where just about anything can be characterized as, this does not occur in nature, multiple freeze-thaw cycles of liver cells and they survive. But that's how the court characterized it. And once you get there, well, the invention is just a straightforward application, so the claims are invalid. In terms of preemption, basically what the district court said is, okay, well, it only preempts a very narrow use of the natural phenomenon, but still, the problem is, if you get lots of people patenting uses, ultimately it's preempted. They kind of talk about a slice like a pie. It's like, well, even if you only take one slice of the pie, other people might take the other slices and the whole pie is gone. And so preemption occurs even if you're taking a very narrow slice of the pie under this kind of rationale. Here's another, September 15th, this is a district court case, it's a method of taking a person's temperature using a thermometer on the forehead. And this was found to be a natural phenomenon at play here. Interestingly, there's a lot of evidence this was totally non-obvious. There was all this prior art teaching away. There was all the experts said this will never work, and the inventors persevered for years and finally showed that it actually does work. Doesn't matter. No matter how novel the concept is, how valuable a contribution to the medical community, no matter how groundbreaking and innovative, the district court said it's still a natural phenomenon. You can't patent it. Here's the most recent, September 23rd. Here we're getting at what technically is a method of drug treatment claim, okay? And that's something I've been concerned about since 2009, is if you go down this road that interaction of a drug with the human body is a natural phenomenon, doesn't that kind of threaten method of treatment claims? Here's a method of drug treatment claim that was found to be invalid, at least by a magistrate judge. He's recommending patent ineligibility. You notice it has it's very similar to the Prometheus claim, kind of personalized medicine, kind of you do a test on a patient to determine the optimal dosage. The critical difference, this patent actually has this claim has a limitation that you use that information to administer drug to a patient, okay? And a lot of people thought, well, the problem with the Prometheus claim is it stopped too early. You do the diagnostic test, the doctor becomes aware that the dosage should be changed. If they had only included this extra step of administering the drug, then the claim would have been patent eligible. We've hoped that. Well, here's a case where they did that, and this judge said, well, that's not enough. He basically said, well, this is a natural phenomenon, the relationship between the severity of renal impairment and bioavailability of the drug, well, that's a natural phenomenon. Pretty much anything's a natural phenomenon, I guess. And they found that the additional steps were quite analogous to Prometheus, and the claim's patent ineligible. So I got 2 minutes. Maybe I'll talk a little bit about the brief we filed for en banc reconsideration of Ariosa. I think the big question we had was, what do we argue here? On the one hand, do we argue that in Ariosa, the Federal Circuit applied an overly stringent interpretation of Mayo, and we'd like the Federal Circuit to go back and reconsider that the language of Mayo is actually kind of broad and would accommodate a more permissive standard that would allow worthwhile inventions to be patented. That's one approach. The other approach, which seems to be Judge Lynn's view from the Federal Circuit based on a concurring opinion he filed, Judge Lynn, I think, basically said, he said the claim in Ariosa, those claims, very valuable, very worthwhile innovation, totally meritorious. He said, under the statute and under policy, there's absolutely no reason these claims should be invalid. But he said, because of unnecessarily broad language in the Mayo decision, he was compelled to go along with the majority and find these claims patent ineligible. To me, what he's saying is, we can't fix it. We need the Supreme Court to come in and fix it. So that's the other approach. So I think at this point, what we're kind of wondering is, can the Federal Circuit come in and fix the situation by kind of interpreting Mayo in a way that's less stringent, or do we really need the Supreme Court or maybe Congress to get involved to fix that? And so that's kind of, I think, where we stand right now. Thanks.
Okay. I think you're up. Great.
Sorry about that.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Jim Calkins. I work for Sanofi. I'm one of the pill pushers in Big Pharma. I'm a patent attorney, and I'm going to be talking to you about recent developments or hot topics in trademark law and advertising law in the pharmaceutical industry. So it's an area in which I'm becoming more involved as time passes, and I thought you all might be interested in it. So just to take a quick show of hands, how many of you think that drug advertising on TV and print to consumers, how many of you think that's a bad thing? How many of you think it's a good thing? I'm a little surprised, because I think the general, so the show of hands was maybe 2 or 3 to 1 of the people who chose to raise their hands, thought it was okay rather than bad. A lot of people think it's a bad thing, and I want to start by saying I think it's actually a good thing. The amount of improper prescription of drugs by physicians is vanishingly low. And in fact, what the surveying shows is that consumer advertising for prescription medicines does substantially increase the use of the drugs that are advertised, but not in a way that causes misuse of the drug. That is, what it causes is more people to get treated in an effective way for whatever it is that that drug does. Anyway, I'm going to talk with you very briefly about 3 different issues. So I really will just be surveying them, but they're tied together with a thing called the exclusionary rule. That is the way that the U.S. government enforces its statutes and regulations affecting the pharmaceutical industry. So show of hands, how many of you know the exclusionary rule and how it gets applied to the pharmaceutical industry? Perfect, nobody. Okay, this is great. The exclusionary rule was passed in the Civil War under the Lincoln administration, and it was passed in response to a bunch of really bad quality uniforms, guns, ammunition, and things like that being sold to the Union Army, okay? And the exclusionary rule, the statute that was passed in response, said, if you're found guilty of violating a statute or regulation in sales to the U.S. government, that one of the things that the court can do after finding this violation is prohibit the company from selling anything to the U.S. government moving forward. So that's the exclusionary rule. The exclusionary rule has been applied to the pharmaceutical industry and particularly to multinational pharmaceutical companies to threaten that in response to a purported violation of statute or rule, that company will be precluded from selling any drugs at all out of the entire pharmacy of that company to the U.S. government. That's an incredibly powerful tool for the federal government to compel settlement of disputes rather than litigation of disputes to a litigated conclusion, because these multinational pharmaceutical companies are, without exception, publicly traded companies. And the threat of the exclusionary rule in disputes with the federal government, if that dispute is not immediately settled causes depression of the stock price, which then causes a set of shareholder derivative lawsuits against the company. So for publicly traded multinational companies, the exclusionary rule drives behavior in disputes with the U.S. government. Okay, so that's just how it works. So now let me give you the survey on what's going on in trademarks. First is on consumer advertising and warning statements. All of you have seen ads on TV for various drugs. And we all know in watching those commercials that it starts off with an initial statement about the efficacy of some particular drug, and then it's followed for the bulk of the commercial with warning statements, right? And we've heard these warning statements so much, we stop paying attention to the warning statements, right? In fact, for the most part, we don't pay attention to the drug advertisement because it's so boring, it's filled up with these warning statements. Just think about that just for a moment from the context of normal consumer goods. So think about Planters peanuts. It's a food item. Planters peanuts, people have allergies to peanuts. People can choke on peanuts, but that's not included in the advertisement for Planters peanuts. If the FDA were to regulate advertisement for Planters peanuts, those statements would have to be in. The Mr. Planters peanuts with the monocle and the cane and the top hat could imply to a consumer that that peanuts will make you smarter, so that would have to go out. And so just think, for food products, if FDA regulations related to drug advertising were applied to that, food advertising would be completely different. Okay, so warning statements. Our proposition is that the FDA regulations on warning statements in consumer advertising has gone so far outside the range of reasonableness that the true warnings, the real fundamental things that should be told to consumers about those who shouldn't take the drug are being lost. So, for example, people who have heart problems shouldn't take erectile dysfunction drugs because there's a potential interaction that can cause heart failure. But that, to a large extent, is lost in all of the other advertising warnings that are required to be made. So, unfortunately, it's very difficult for the pharmaceutical industry to challenge the rulemaking of FDA and how FDA applies its rules with respect to consumer advertising because of the exclusionary rule. Unfortunate thing. FDA says that it is studying this issue and may come out in the future with rules to simplify the warning requirements, but there is no timetable associated with it. Okay, so that's one. Second is biosimilar naming. How many of you know about small molecule versus biologic drugs? Show of hands. So let's say half. Okay, so small molecule drugs are the traditional pills that we all take. Take it with a glass of water, take it by mouth. Those so-called small molecules aren't so small. I'm an old chemical engineer and I used to make ethylene a really small molecule. So these small molecule drugs are not that, but they are synthesized in chemical reactions. So they're traditional chemical engineering manufacturing techniques. Biologic drugs are fundamentally different in that they are produced from living organisms, from cells that have had their DNA modified in some way. The difference there in manufacturing and how those drugs are made between biologics and small molecules is really important. Turns out that small molecule drugs, since they are chemically synthesized, can be made in lots of different places, possibly in different ways, and you end up with an identical molecule, chemically indistinguishable one from another. You can't do that with biologics. When you make biologics in different plants, even though you're using the same cells that have been modified in their DNA, the chemical that comes out at the end is demonstrably different. So it is impossible to make replaceable, substitutable biologic drugs, where it's entirely possible to make completely substitutable generic drugs. So generics apply to small molecules, biosimilars apply to biologic drugs. So how does this apply in trademarks? In generic drugs, or in normal drugs, there are two names. There's the brand name that has trademark value that's associated with it, and there's the generic name. The generic name is just the name of the active moiety, named either through chemical convention or through negotiation with FDA. In generic drugs, the innovator has got the brand name and the generic name associated with the product. So the product packaging will have both names on it. The generic equivalent doesn't contain a brand name and only has the generic or active moiety name on it. But in biosimilars, there is no equivalent rule around brand names. So for Sanofi's largest selling biologic drug is human insulin. It's called Lantus. Anybody who knows type 1 diabetic, it's entirely possible that that person takes Lantus. In fact, I have a daughter who's diabetic, she takes Lantus. That's the brand name. The generic name is insulin glargine. So how do you go about naming a biosimilar to Lantus when what comes out of the plant is, although it's the same DNA modified organism, it's a different characterized product? How do you do that? So FDA did set rules for how the generic name gets used for biosimilars, and that is that someone who makes a biosimilar version of Lantus will call their product insulin glargine and then 4 letters. Let's say it's ABCD. Okay, and if somebody else makes another version of Lantus, it will be called insulin glargine EFGH. Okay? But the question is, from a trademark perspective, in biosimilars, does the biosimilar manufacturer for a version of Lantus for insulin glargine need to have their own brand name for the drug? Turns out FDA has no rules on this at all. And our position in the innovative pharmaceutical industry is that biosimilars are sufficiently dissimilar from each other because they are not substitutable. Clinical trials have to be run to show that they are generally replaceable, but they are not substitutable for each other, that those drugs those biosimilar versions ought to have their own brand name associated with it. So that's an issue that's in discussion between the pharmaceutical industry and FDA, another issue. And finally, last issue I want to talk with you about is off-label promotion. Show of hands, who's heard of off-label promotion of drugs? Okay, so more than half. Off-label promotion in general results in use of drugs in average about 20% higher. So maybe a 25% increase in sales to a pharmaceutical company associated with off-label use, and that's as a general rule. In some drugs, the amount of off-label use of the drug can be over 50% of its sales. Extreme circumstances, it could be 70% of sales. So what's the issue in trademarks and advertising with off-label promotion? FDA strictly prohibits pharmaceutical companies that sell the brand name version of a drug from off-label promoting its use. So strict prohibition against it. What's the problem with that? Well, the problem is that that can disserve patients. How does that happen? Just because a drug doesn't have on its approved label that FDA has reviewed and approved as the result of the pharmaceutical company proving through clinical trials that the statements are correct, it doesn't mean that the drug can't be used appropriately, effectively, safely in other uses, and that's what off-label use is. Although FDA prohibits pharmaceutical companies from promoting off-label use of drugs to physicians, physicians are completely free to prescribe drugs off-label. And they do, so that approximately 20% of prescriptions of most drugs in general are off-label. So, how many of you have heard about off-label promotion and the First Amendment, this issue? Just a few. Okay. I'm sure everybody here can understand that advertising and promoting drugs is commercial speech that's governed under the Central Hudson Supreme Court case. It's got a four-prong analysis. When government regulation around commercial speech, the analysis has four elements to it. This off-label prohibition by FDA has never been challenged by a multinational pharmaceutical company, and it can't be challenged by a multinational pharmaceutical company because it results in imposition of the exclusionary rule threat. So FDA's prohibition cannot effectively be challenged by any publicly owned pharmaceutical company. So how does this actually get challenged? The way that this has come up in a couple of court cases, one in 2012 and one in 2013, was when FDA sought criminal sanctions against individual salespeople for selling drugs off-label or for promoting off-label use of the drugs. In those circumstances, the court in one case found in favor of the salesperson and in another found against a company based on truthful statements by the salesperson. Although it was off-label, it was truthful speech. And in the other circumstance, it was fraudulent advertising that was promulgated by a company. In that circumstance, the courts ruled that the First Amendment does apply to these FDA regulations, and FDA can't stop off-label promotion just because of the First Amendment. So we will see how that plays out in the future, but again, the multinationals can't fight that battle because of the exclusionary rule. Anyway, thank you all very much.
All right, next up is Mike.
Well, thank you.
Slides? Okay.
Thank you. I'm just going to sit here, I think, and talk from here a little easier for me. So you may be wondering why someone from Dupont was invited by Mark and Adam to speak here about issues in biotech and pharmaceutical. Well, not pharmaceutical. We have the pharmaceutical guy beside me here, Jim from Sanofi. But Dupont actually has, I think, probably the largest in-house biotech patent practice in the country. Now, we're not involved in pharmaceutical biotechnology, but it's more industrial biotechnology, what some people call white biotechnology. And that involves enzymes and biofuels, things like that, as well as agricultural biotechnology. Dupont owns Pioneer Seed, which is the second largest seed company in the world and makes and sells genetically modified seeds. So that's why I'm here speaking about biotechnology. So I thought I'd focus my comments on two things. One on 101, so we've heard a lot about that, some 101 issues, and then I thought I would talk about IPRs. So when I came in, the previous panel, I heard Morgan Reed, and I heard him very clearly. He talked about people running scared and broke. I thought, oh, this must be a retiree conference. I said, I'm in the wrong room, or a different room than I expected to be, a little premature. But actually, he was talking about startups. And he talked about startups having and wanting settled expectations. And so that's what I want to talk about with respect to 101. So as I mentioned, I did retire from Dupont yesterday, so these are my personal comments and not those of the company. With 101, the settled expectations for a long time was everything is patentable is everything under the sun made by man. We know that very well. And what some people would call is quite a public taking by some of the rulings by the Supreme Court in terms of restricting patent-eligible subject matter. I really think this Prometheus case was a bellwether case because that really started the ball rolling, I think, in the wrong direction. You know, when you look at that case, and Professor can comment on this, but A lot of people thought that should have been decided not on 101, but on 102 and 103, on whether it was anticipated or non-obvious. And in fact, as I recall, the brief by the solicitor in that case, Solicitor General, focused exactly on that issue, which Justice Breyer dismissed very, very quickly at the end of that decision. But I had always, in my career, my 25-year career or 30-year career as a patent attorney, for us, 101 was a very, very small hurdle. I mean, almost a non-existent hurdle. And then it was 102 and 103. And now, with the way 101 is being interpreted, or has been interpreted by the Supreme Court, it has become a pretty significant hurdle. I talk about these settled expectations. Two examples. One is on the Myriad case. There are thousands and thousands of patent claims to isolated DNA. There are a lot of patent claims in Dupont granted patents to isolated DNA. I mean, the amount of effort it takes. So, for example, in the ag biotech area, one of the things you look for is you look for crops that may have natural resistance to a fungus. And then you start to breed with those, and you work to isolate that DNA. I mean, that is incredibly valuable invention, incredibly expensive to isolate the DNA that gives that particular trait to a particular crop. In this case, it relates to corn. But you file a patent application on it, you claim the isolated DNA, and then very quickly that patent gets wiped out. So when you look at that, you say, what? Oh, and then let me just say, on the Sequenom case, the Sequenom patent that was invalidated was granted in 2000, or in that case, the patent that was invalidated was granted in 2001. So here you are 14 years later, and that patent gets wiped out. So in terms of the settled expectations and the certainty that not just startups, but that companies want, this is an incredible taking of patent rights. You look at it as an incredible taking of patent rights because those patents get all wiped out. From the practical point of view, you look at the poor patent attorney, the poor patent scrivener, who's writing those claims in that period of time. How can they anticipate the way that the law is going to meander? It's really a huge, huge challenge. And thank goodness, we have very good patent attorneys, as others do, and a lot of these claims to isolated DNA had other claims in them that would attach promoters and other things that would make them patent eligible even under the current standards. But it is a significantly moving target. A couple impacts of that. One is I think we'll see fewer patent filings, and the data from fiscal year 2015 for the Patent Office show that. I saw on a blog this morning that patent grants are down about 3% year over year. Patent filings are also down. Patent fee collections are down as a result, but patent filings are down in the office. And a lot of people look at that as a result of Alice, Myriad, and Mayo. So there's certainly that impact. But I think an even more significant impact is around the move to protect innovation, not by patents, by trade secrets. Because at the time when we see some of the strengths of patents changing, and I'm pretty sure that tomorrow the Federal Circuit is going to hear en banc this Lexmark case around international exhaustion of rights. If there's anything that would prompt someone in my position to retire, it's that Lexmark case if it goes the wrong way. But when you look at the impact on patent rights, and then you look at the improvement, ongoing improvement in trade secrets, you can say that trade secrets will become a better way to protect innovation. So in the U.S., we have Senator Coons, my senator from Delaware, introduced this bill that would make a federal cause of action for private federal cause of action for trade secret protection, really strong protection around IP rights. There's a movement in Europe to strengthen IP rights at a European level. So very, very positive moves in terms of trade secret protection. And then this social contract where you say, well, you disclose your invention in exchange for a limited monopoly, starts to get frustrated when people start to keep these inventions as trade secrets and not publish them. So you lose the social benefit of building on what's otherwise published innovation. So I certainly think that's something that requires close attention. I mean, this 101 issue with where it is now, hopefully the Sequenom case gets changed, but certainly it could, it's one way to address it is legislatively, but that is a blunt tool. And so I know people are thinking about, not so much in the context of the current bills, HR 9 and S 1139 on the Hill now, 1137, see, I retired 2 days ago, and I can't remember, 1139, 1137. 37, there we go, thanks. And so, you know, not in the context of those bills, but potentially looking at 101 to address these issues, to give the broad protection that's really been a focus of the biotech and pharma industry for so long. However, this 101 issue, to me, if you open that up, it doesn't always go in the direction you may want it, and that's, I think, the fear some people have, that you open up 101 and it may not lead to a strengthening. I mean, you read some of the briefing in the Myriad case, and you can say there are a lot of people who think that biotech rights should be narrowed. So anyway, lot going on there, but it's a very difficult challenge from a practical point of view for an in-house legal organization or private industry in general to deal with this this constantly changing 101, and I think you'll see the dynamics changing. As I said, I think the data in the patent office is already showing that. The other thing I'll mention, and I see my time's actually going to run out here soon, is just talking about the IPRs. The inter-parties review came into effect with the AIA, and it's certainly drawn a lot of attention from, certainly from the pharma industry, is very unhappy about it. In the biotech industry, just about 9% of the IPRs instituted have been in biotechnology. Most of them have been in other areas, mostly in the electrical arts. And I'd say that, you know, these proceedings are still relatively new, still being worked through. You know, the office is where, I think the patent office is really doing a very good job within the confines of the statute to carry out these proceedings. Every proceeding that's gone to completion has been within the 1 year statutory period, hasn't required the additional 6 months that are available. In March, the office put out the quick fix package for IPRs, which was positive. August of this year, they published a Federal Register notice after a very extensive listening tour by the office to get input from people as to changes they would like to see with respect to IPR proceedings. They came out with a number of changes in this Federal Register notice, primarily allowing I think the one that's got the most attention is allowing petitioners to file evidence at the petition stage to support their position. But there's also a Rule 11 requirement that's being proposed. So I think things are headed in the right direction there, at least from the biotech point of view. The pharma industry, I think, has a different view, and certainly with the bills in Congress that IPR is certainly an issue in flux. But I think from the overall biotech point of view, I'll tell you, my experience has been in litigation that some of the patents that we had to litigate, I had really wished that there had been an IPR proceeding available at that time, because there were issues with the office granting patents that we felt were too broad, and certainly based upon art that had not been considered and would have been a viable alternative to the litigation. So I think from my view, from the industrial or agricultural biotechnology point of view, I think these proceedings have been okay. I mean, certainly need some improvements. Others feel differently. I think you only need to look at Senator Coons, again, introduced a Strong Patent Act, which is proposing significant changes around the burden of proof, the standing issue for whether, you know, who can bring an IPR. And so I think we'll have to see how these things shake out in the ongoing legislative process here, because there are pretty strong points of view. When I talk to my colleagues in the IT industry, their view is strongly that these are fair, reasonable proceedings, and frankly don't want to see changes. And others feel, particularly with respect to the difficulty in getting amendments to claims, that that is an issue that really requires a new view. I hear that there are people working on that potentially on the legislative side, but as I say, we'll have to wait and see how how that shakes out. But I'd certainly compliment the office on the work they've done, but we'll see how this plays out in this Congress, if anything can get done on a legislative level. So I'll end there.
Thank you. I'll be talking about intellectual property as a platform for access to pharmaceuticals. What do I mean by that? I want to look at the function of IP rights in the pharmaceutical market once a drug already exists. We focus a lot on R&D, we being scholars, industry, critics, focus on R&D costs and how that drives the cost and availability of drugs, R&D costs and regulatory approval and compliance costs. But one thing I've noticed about this debate is that the big scary numbers that we talk about in terms of the cost of R&D to develop a drug and to get it through clinical trials, these big scary numbers tend to focus people's attention on that issue. And particularly what critics tend to do is they tend to look for an alternative solution to finance drug R&D. And they look for alternatives to patents in particular. And they come up with their solutions. And the problem I've been thinking about with the solutions they often offer is that, well, I think they kind of rely on this principle that if the drug gets developed, it will somehow get to consumers. They don't really consider the commercialization aspects of the pharmaceutical market. You know, how do consumers find out about it? How do you actually get it into their hands? I'll talk about that more in a moment. There's an additional motivation I have with respect to considering this issue. It's that I often hear that there's no evidence that increasing the strength of IP rights as a result of the TRIPS agreement has benefited developing countries and LDCs. Where have I heard this? Well, I've actually heard it individually at things like I've attended stakeholder discussions at a round of negotiation of the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade agreement. And so I show up, and they've had many rounds of negotiation, and I show up, they have the stakeholder meeting, and they set it up like a science fair, sort of. I had my table there. I put out, being a law professor, or being a professor, I had this faith in academic studies, and I brought a stack of academic studies showing the benefits, the trade-related benefits of strengthening IP rights. And I hadn't been attending these rounds of negotiations around the world, so I had an interesting experience when I encountered the IP negotiators from several of the countries. They came around and talked to us because they had to. They were required to. So they came up to my table, and one of the lead IP negotiators from a developed country looked at the studies I had. I told them what they were, and he said, this is interesting, because there have been some academics who've come to every round. They're sitting at a table across the hall, and they told us these studies don't exist. They say exactly this. Later in a private meeting with one of the lead IP negotiators from a developing country, she very emphatically stated this to me. She said, American academics and NGOs are telling me something different from your government. They're telling me that there is no proof, no studies, nothing supporting the proposition that strengthening IP rights does anything good for developing countries with respect to trade. So I thought, well, this is a useful exercise then to examine the literature on this question and ask whether there is any support for a relationship between access to drugs and the strength of IP rights. And along the way, let's see what studies there are. And in my conference paper, if there are such studies, I can cite them, and maybe it will help my fellow legal academics find them if they're cited on a paper that appears in Westlaw and Lexis. Maybe that's the problem, why they think these studies don't exist. Now, before I start out, I think I need to establish I'm not attacking a straw man. And I anticipated this. Jim said to me right before the panel, he said, there can't be anyone who actually believes this. And I've done a paper like this before refuting a proposition that people in industry say nobody can actually believe this. So maybe I spend my time tilting at windmills or beating up straw men. The problem is, though, that when you look at the literature and the popular discourse and the public policy discussion, there are people who implicitly believe this. The proposals to replace the IP system, to somehow finance R&D outside of the patent system, they tend to definitely neglect the commercialization aspect. And so there have been a number of proposals over the years. I'll focus on prizes, and they're so popular. The idea of replacing patents with a government-funded prize is so popular I can't give you any one particular site because there's many people who love this proposal. And very rarely do they talk about how the drugs will actually get into consumers' hands. It's just, we'll finance R&D and then everybody will be able to freely distribute them. And in particular, I'll note that there's a Nobel Prize winner who often advocates this proposition, Joseph Stiglitz. Just like my last paper, I was able to find a Nobel Prize winner who believed this allegedly unbelievable thing. And so let's consider why property rights might facilitate the availability of pharmaceuticals. Well, you have a company who's developed a proprietary drug, and they want to secure their investment in innovation, in R&D, and in the money they spent on regulatory compliance, but they have some other things they need to do to get that drug into the hands of consumers. They need to make people aware it exists, the marketing that Jim talked about. And this marketing consists of very retail-level marketing, going to medical professionals, teaching them about the drug, educating patients that the drug exists, and that there may be something that can help them with their condition, establishing distribution networks, and even setting up complements, things like diagnostic devices that are necessary to aid in using the drug. All of these things have the characteristic of public goods. If one company spends money on them, what they're doing is essentially breaking the path for potential competitors. And what intellectual property rights protect is that investment in this path breaking, because nobody wants to make this investment and then be undercut by their competitors. There's no economic sense, there's no business sense in making this investment unless you can get a return and recapture the investment you've made. And so this is the theoretical proposition here that there's reason to believe that IP rights might encourage pharmaceutical companies to do things that get drugs into the hands of consumers. Let's see what the literature says. So there have been studies on this topic, and these studies tend to be international studies. They look at, because of what's very attractive to economists is what we might call the natural experiment of the TRIPS agreement. The TRIPS agreement is an agreement that when countries signed on to it to be a member of the WTO in 1994, they had to agree and eventually increase their IP standards, make their IP laws more rigorous. And this can be considered an exogenously imposed change for most of the countries in the world. Most of the countries didn't do this really all that willingly. They did it because they wanted to be a member of the WTO, which creates an opportunity for an economist, because what we can infer from this situation is that is that the stronger IP rights are not associated with a country that innovates more, or that a country that tends to have drugs available, that's not the cause, but rather the causation would run the other way. A country is required to increase their IP rights, and let's see what happens after that. And the literature looks at three effects. The import volume of pharmaceuticals. How many pharmaceuticals are flowing into a country? The timing of product launch. What is the how fast are new pharmaceuticals getting into a particular country, and how does that relate to the strength of their IP rights? And then just simple flat-out availability. Are these drugs available in these countries? So let's look at the literature. We have several studies that have found a positive relationship between TRIPS implementation and increased trade in knowledge-intensive goods, Delgado, including pharmaceuticals. Park and Lippold found that strengthening patent rights strongly positively associated with increased pharmaceutical imports to developing countries and LDCs. So they focused on developing countries and LDCs and found this relationship. Ivis had a similar result, and in her case, what I thought was useful in that case is she also said this isn't just an effect of increasing market power, we're seeing an increased volume of product, because these other two studies measured the dollar amount of trade, the dollar volume. So Ivis helps confirm these other studies, tends to support these other studies showing a positive effect on availability. Okay, I'm going to skip over this and look at timing of product launch. So this is another set of indicators that's been studied. And so there's an important paper by Coburn and his co-authors. It continues the work of the late Jeannie Lanzhou. And what these two papers together, Lanzhou's 2005 paper and the recent Coburn et al. Paper, found is that the speed of drug launch, how soon drugs get into a country, come onto market in a country, is positively associated with the strength of patent protection. In fact, so they found a negative association between weaker patent rights. The weaker the patent rights are, the more likely there is to be delay. And in fact, they noted that many drugs never come to market in the weak IP countries. Borel similarly found for a smaller subset of data looking at the speed of launch of HIV drugs in developing countries, positively associated with the strength of patent protection. Finally, the metric of availability. Two studies here, Berndt and Coburn recently looked at the availability of drugs in India versus the rest of the world. What did they find? Well, they looked at the 184 drugs approved by the US FDA between 2000 and 2009, sorry. And half were delayed in India by at least 5 years or more. So they're saying, look, India has weaker IP rights. They are waiting for drugs. They're not getting them as soon, and some of them they're not getting at all. An earlier study by Berndt found similarly that the probability of a drug being available at all was the lowest in countries with weak patent protection. All right, so conclusion. What can we find? What do we find here? There are several studies that find a relationship between stronger IP rights and access to drugs. There appears to be a relationship between stronger IP rights and availability of drugs to patients. This is a really important positive result. That's a positive result with respect to IP rights and a positive result with respect to the effects of the TRIPS agreement. So we're seeing an association with stronger IP rights. We're seeing more imports of pharmaceuticals, faster launches, and more simply available, period. And this tends to support the proposition that IP rights support investment in education and infrastructure, all the things you need to do to commercialize a drug and get them to patients. And finally, yeah, there's actually evidence, my dear colleagues in the Legal Academy, there's actually evidence that strengthening IP rights, at least on one metric, of an important metric, availability of drugs to patients, that there have been post-TRIPS benefits for developing and least developed countries. So, thanks.
Wonderful. So let me see. Are there questions from the audience? All right, start over here.
Yesterday and today, we've heard about increased use of trade secret protection. And this goes to Michael Walker, if I'd like to ask him to address this. I have Ms.
Can you
guilty
turn
as-
on the microphone, please?
Was on. Is that better?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So this goes to the issue of increased use of trade secret protection. And I'm as guilty as everyone in the room probably of telling clients to rely more on trade secrets recently. The concern I have is that we're looking at potentially having a game, I'm sorry, of intellectual property whack-a-mole. We're seeing increased hacking by Chinese, Russians, excuse me, a whole group of entities. What is to stop a Chinese entity, you may not even know you've been hacked by them, taking your trade secret, they're now entering your space. Fine, you finally find out, you take them to court, but you only have a cause of action against them. They just pass the secret down the road. Is trade secret really the answer?
Yeah. So that's a great question. And there are a number of public cases around trade secret theft from Dupont that are out there. Recent one was around a Korean company who stole our Kevlar trade secrets. And so it's a very good practical question. And I think, again, the balance is patent protection versus trade secret protection. And I think you have to look at that like any investment. And you're starting a project and you say, okay, what are we going to do here? And if we're going to rely on patent protection, you say, what is our availability? How easy will it be able to enforce that IP right against an infringer, maybe outside the U.S., maybe inside the U.S., get adequate damages, get an injunction, permanent injunction, maybe. So what are you getting there versus trade secrets? What I think has happened, and I've given people advice over my 30-plus years, yeah, just keep it as a trade secret. But what's really changed, I think, is that companies are taking it much more seriously. So companies are adopting corporate trade secret policies, making adherence to the policy a condition of employment, requiring certification, taking steps around protecting trade secrets when they go, when they're used. So some trade secrets clearly identified, kept on a server that has no external access to the internet, but the trade secrets are protected in that way, so there's a very limited number of people who can get to them. So I think there are a number of things that can be done, and we try to do them at Dupont to really strengthen the trade secret protection, so that when you look at that balance, you can say, yeah, the balance, when you take into account prior user rights, which I didn't mention in the US, you take into account, you can tip the balance in favor of trade secrets. But it's a great point, and they say that there's only two entities out there, people who have been hacked and those who have been hacked but don't know it. And so it's certainly an ongoing issue, but it's that balance that I think is important. And I do see trade secrets getting stronger, personal view.
I'd like to sort of pile onto that question a little bit and ask everybody this, because this theme of a whole system that's providing a platform, and maybe if we're having weaknesses because of 101 cases, the trade secret part of the platform is going to get stronger. But I wonder if maybe they're protecting different things. I mean, in the pharmaceutical and biotech space, I'm not sure that if we lose the benefit of composition of matter claims because of 101, the trade secret part can step up. And I don't know, I guess I'd like to hear people's thoughts on whether they're different pieces of a puzzle rather than able to replace each other for the industry.
I can go ahead a little bit on this. I've done a large multi-country study of trade secret strength and its economic effects for the OECD. And what my co-author and I found after we constructed an index of trade secret protection, measuring the strength of trade secret protection for about 40 countries over the past 30 years, is we found that trade secrets appear to have important effects in the IP system that I think are undervalued. Trade secrets play an important role as a complement to patents. And so often when we have these discussions, as the last question indicated, we as practitioners and often focusing on, as practitioners, we focus on the moment of making a decision about what to do with a particular technology. And we often focus on that decision in academic research. But if we look at the question system-wide, not with respect to a particular technology, but to a firm's R&D efforts overall, or R&D on a national level, what we find is trade secrets serve a complementary role, a different role from patents. And so when we looked at the economic effects, for example, controlling for patent strength, we found trade secrets, stronger trade secrets were associated with more spending on R&D, more researchers per million, more domestic patent filings. Isn't that interesting? That's a complementary effect. And what's going on there, I think, when you really think about it, before you have, and Jim Pooley said this yesterday, before you have a patent, you have a trade secret. And more than that, any patent represents any patent arises from a large body of R&D, most of which isn't patentable in of itself, but it's something you want to be able to protect with trade secrets. And so, yes, to Erica's question, they serve a very different role, but an important role. But for inventions that are discernible and can't be kept secret, of course, trade secrets are only the answer up until the point you want to go to market with them. And one last thing, I think one of our interesting results I skipped over in my slides, my one original point in that presentation might have been the fact that we found that trade secret strength was strongly positively associated with pharmaceutical imports, controlling for patent strength. So trade secrets in and of themselves have a strong effect, even regardless of the strength of the patent system. So I'll let others answer Erica's question now.
Or if there are other questions from the audience, either way.
Well, let me make a comment about this, the practical real-world effects. I think, and those who have been in practice a long time, I think most of us will agree, that we're in a cycle of weakening patent rights as opposed to the 70s, 80s, and maybe up until the mid or late 90s when we were in an era of strengthening patent rights. The particular doctrine or theory that's used to weaken patent rights, that is to kill patents or prevent them from being issued, that in a stronger patent environment would have been issued and would have been upheld, is not particularly important. In fact, I think somebody made a reference to whack-a-mole a while back, and I think the legal theory is essentially a whack-a-mole concept. That is, if Section 101 were completely fixed to the pharmaceutical and biotech industry's dream, it wouldn't make a substantial difference. Some other doctrine would pop up and be used to kill the same patents. So in that circumstance, what's the effect? The effect, I think, from a practical standpoint in the pharmaceutical industry is the switch from small molecule drugs to biologics. Why such a large-scale change, you might ask, just because the patents are getting a little bit weaker? And the reason why is, think of patents in the overall context of barrier to entry. There are barriers to entry associated with biologic drugs that do not exist for small molecule drugs. For one, biosimilars have to go through clinical trials. Clinical trials are those clinical trials that have to be done to get a biosimilar approved are expensive and constitute an R&D or development expense. That expense has to be recovered in the price. And so there's less inherent price competition with biosimilar drugs than there are with small molecule drugs that don't have to go through anything like the kind of clinical trial that biosimilars do. Similarly, there's trade secret protection that the biotech industry uses associated with its manufacturing plants. So there's a barrier to entry associated with manufacturing biologics that does not exist with small molecules. Finally, there is a regulatory market exclusivity period that is substantially different with biologics in the US compared to small molecules. For small molecule drugs, the traditional drugs developed by the pharmaceutical industry, there's an effective 7.5-year market exclusivity period. It's 5 years by statute, and then the 30-month Hatch-Waxman stay that I'm sure some of you know about. For biologics, that period of market exclusivity is at least 12 years. So, and by the time you get done with the associated litigation, it's probably close to double that for small molecule drugs. It is those other kinds of barriers to entry, regulatory exclusivity, trade secrets around manufacturing, larger expense in clinical trials associated with getting approval, that have driven the pharmaceutical industry toward the biologic model and away from small molecules. So what's the problem, you might say? Big deal. Well, biologics may have substantial advantages over small molecule drugs in terms of side effects. So there may be a substantial improvement in the utility of these drugs with a reduction of side effects. However, all biologics have to be administered through much more difficult routes of administration compared to small molecules. Small molecules you take by mouth. For the most part, those drugs don't have to be refrigerated for storage. For biologics, they're all issued somehow through some kind of an injection. They can't be taken by mouth because they'll just be dissociated in the intestinal tract into amino acids, and so you'll lose the drug. So, and then there is a cold chain associated with it. In addition, the fundamental price is higher because of the manufacturing difficulties associated with biologics compared to small molecules. So we damage the patent system, and the effect in the pharmacy industry is we shift to drugs that have other barriers to entry associated with them besides patents. And what does it do? It drives up the price for everybody.
Eric, I'll just say that I hear what Jim is saying. That really relates to pharmaceuticals. I would take a 101 fix for the rest of biotechnology, industrial and agricultural biotechnology, because I don't think, I mean, there are some regulatory hurdles in the ag area, but I think a 101 fix would be very welcome, frankly.
I'm not saying we shouldn't fix 101.
Yeah. So I would say one idea that people have talked about for quite a while is to extend this 12 years of data exclusivity that's afforded biologics to drugs. And I've heard some people say, well, pharmaceuticals should move away from such a heavy reliance on patents and go towards the regulatory, which really is a combination of regulatory and trade secret. As long as you've got trade secret protection for the underlying information to get the approval, it's half as long basically for conventional drugs. They've got 12 years for the biologics. You could extend it to drugs to 12 years. What's the downside to that? I think some of the things I've heard is that it would be easier for Congress to come in later and change, you give them 12 years, which should approximate something like what a lot of people think they should be getting from a patent anyway. But if you notice, immediately after the BPCIA, which gave 12 years for biologics, immediately the White House and some others were trying to reduce that. So I think the problem with relying on regulatory for drugs as opposed to patents is I think it's more susceptible to politics and being shrunk. Also, I kind of worry how it would be applied in other countries where, we've worked so long to try to get some uniformity in patent protection. I don't know that we have that outside the U.S. But, outside, when I think about diagnostics in 101, one thing that strikes me is for a major drug company, I think they can develop diagnostics and even without a patent find ways of monetizing that because of the regulatory. But one thing I think you could lose without patents, I can think of a company whose business model was to identify drugs and then try to develop diagnostic tests to identify new patient subsets or maybe a drug that was never approved, try to find a subset that would allow approval. it seems to me if that's your business model and that's what you're doing, you're not actually the one going to commercialize the drug, it would help very much to be able to get a patent so that you'd have something to license to a drug company. I guess maybe strong trade secret protection could help in that to some extent. But I think one thing patents do is they allow other kind of business models that I don't think are as available if you're just going to rely on non-patent ways of monetizing these kind of inventions. You know.
Other questions from the audience? Sure. Heck.
I'll be real quick. From a practical standpoint, what do you think best practices are for stop loss for existing portfolios post Mayo and Alice?
Well, that's for. Yeah, all right. I'll take a crack at that. You know, stop loss. I don't know. I mean, to an extent, it is what it is, unless there's some way, you know, still available to amend claims through, you know, cases that are still pending, or to, I don't know, file reissue or something. But it's very hard. And you know, when I looked at our patent portfolio, I advised our management about the impact all along on the Myriad case. I mean, that case we know went on and on and on. And all along, I advised that, you know, the impact this is going to have on, you know, certain parts of our portfolio. We did an analysis, and thank goodness we had lots of other claims that we could use to help enforce. I think that's really what I would suggest from a practical point of view, that if I were still in-house, I would advise, or with external clients, to advise to do a review of some of these patents and say, this is the potential impact. I mean, I'd like to hear Chris's view as where he thinks sequenom is eventually will come out, and whether 101 is going to work out differently. But that's what I would say. I would do some assessment and say, look, some of these claims are at risk, and evaluate that, or see what the impact that would have on the business model, and what other options there are for protection.
Yeah, I'm not, you know, in terms of stopgap, if the patent's already issued, yeah, there's limited. You get a good litigator. I think part of it would be how if you're going before a court, how you convince the court that it's not preempting a building block. I think that's a lot of what they're looking at. I do think when I look at patent eligibility and I see claims being invalidated that are playing bingo on the internet and managing risk using a computer and so forth, I do kind of think that that's what the Supreme Court was getting at, and that they would say that was what we intended. Whereas I think it's very different in biopharmaceuticals, that I think if the Supreme Court justices saw some of these, like the sequenom claims, and really understood what's going on there, that probably, or a drug method of treatment claims, things like that, probably the response would be, that's not really what we intended. We intended to prevent the patenting of these kind of building blocks. So I think maybe in terms of if Congress is not the answer, and if it's not the Supreme Court, maybe eventually the court's coming to understand that this really is the kind of invention that really Justice Breyer talked about in the Mayo decision, that he suggested this doesn't implicate conventional method of treatment claims and so forth, to get the court to understand that that's what's going on, that this is a meritorious invention, that this was really not what the Supreme Court intended. And maybe it will get the Supreme Court's attention eventually if they start seeing that a lot of claims that really are technology, really are worthwhile, are not being screened out by the two-step kind of test as it's being implemented right now.
Other questions? I'm not seeing any hands. Is there? Good. There's a question there. Good.
Yes. The big elephant in the room, of course, is the Supreme Court. And it seems to be of the view that patents do promote innovation, and so would agree, apparently, with a lot of what's said here. But then, to quote Justice Breyer, I think in the opening paragraph of Mayo, patents promote innovation, but too many patents retard innovation. I'd be interested in your comments about the latter part of that statement. He cites no authority Do you know of any authority? Or do you have any reason to believe that there's merit to what the Supreme Court keeps saying over and over again? I think that theme it accounts really for a lot of the Supreme Court decision-making.
Yeah, well, I agree. I mean, that's what I said. I think that what they're getting at is there is a belief, you know, it goes back to this patent thicket idea. There was a lot of people who wrote about this idea that there's a thicket of patents is going to hinder innovation, and they were specifically talking about things, gene patents, patents on fundamental discoveries in the biotech side of things. And so I think yeah, the Supreme Court justices like Breyer believe that too many patents, particularly in the life sciences area, will tie up the building blocks and create a thicket and make it hard for future innovation. That's their belief. But they also clearly believe that patents play an important role if tied to applications. And it does seem like the way it's playing out with some of those examples I presented, that it's really ensnaring real applications that are not fundamental building blocks. But maybe part of the problem is I think the judges don't really get it. And I think a lot of times the judges, they'll see a claim like the sequinome or some of these claims, and they believe, well, this is kind of broadly covering a fundamental principle, and they believe that there's other ways to claim it more narrowly that would provide value and would incentivize innovation, and it's just a matter of doing that, and they don't understand that a lot of times there really isn't. Here's a good example. In the Supreme Court's Myriad decision, the Supreme Court quotes Justice Bryson of the Federal Circuit and says, well, you know, just because these particular claims are invalid, there's lots of other claims that Myriad could have gotten as the discoverer of these genes that would have provided a lot of value. And Bryson pointed to very specific claims that he said, well, these claims are going to be fine. Okay. Later on, in the next round of the Myriad litigation, those, you know, with Ambry genetics and so forth, after the Supreme Court decision, those very claims that the Supreme Court and Judge Bryson pointed to as the claims that would be okay and that were available to Myriad, those were found to be invalid under Mayo. And so I think part of the problem is the judges assume that there are other kind of claims available that would do the job because they don't understand it enough to realize that sometimes there really isn't as a practical matter.
When John says the justices are expressing the sentiment too many patents, I'm reminded of the movie Amadeus, where Emperor Franz Joseph's allegedly constructive critique of Mozart's latest piece is too many notes, and I think that critique perhaps has the same amount of real understanding underlying it. You know, you get the sense that we know that justices are reading the New York Times and other media and discourse and academic research in some cases that's very critical of the patent system, and I think they're reading and being influenced by certain rather specious numbers, what we've taken a stand and started calling junk science, claiming, you know, the patent system is harmful. So beyond, you know, I'm taking a step beyond the dry legal analysis and saying, you know, there's politics going on here, and there's a lot of propaganda and a lot of somewhat dubious academic research, not somewhat, very dubious academic research being deployed constantly and certain numbers repeated daily in the press and on Capitol Hill to essentially malign unfairly the patent system. And so that's part of what we're trying to do at CPIP is introduce rigorous data-driven research into the debate and get it out there into the discussion. And I think that's important because we have the justices read the New York Times.
We might have time for one more question, if there's anything else from the audience. Oh, okay.
Just a follow-up comment on...
Microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry. I can bellow, but I can't bellow that. So just a follow-up comment on Mark's reflections on the question about, is there any evidence that the U.S. patent system, too many patents, is sort of holding up innovation. And there's a test for it. And you can do it fairly easily, which is to ask, well, is there another patent system in an advanced economy that grants fewer patents, that makes it harder to get a patent and harder to enforce a patent, and then look industry by industry and see, okay, which did that economy's industries in those sectors outperform the U.S. economy's industries in those sectors? No one has ever done it. It would be the only clean test, and I think one of the reasons why no one has ever done it is precisely because it's going to show that in the industries where the United States has been dominant, that in exactly those industries, right, the United States does really well. That we don't observe any other real-world patent system that has outperformed the U.S. in terms of biotech or in terms of IT industries and other leading-edge industries.
Yet. We're all worried. Yeah.
All right, well, thank you very much. I have an announcement about lunch, but let's thank the panel first, which is great. Lunch is actually right now, and it is across the hall, and it's starting now, and the keynote speech from David Kapos is going to be at 12:30. Thank you.
Mark,
Mike,
good to
thank
see
you.
again.
All right.